I'd love to give you a chance to explain a little bit of what it is. What is life purpose coaching and life purpose?
Great question. Well, I have my specific bias and lens that I see it through. But for me, purpose, which we'll start with, is really, I believe, this inevitable journey that we all are on as part of this human experience. Obviously, we could talk about the totality of our soul, but we're here having this human experience. And I believe it's really the reason that we're here. And so much of that, I think we've been sort of maybe indoctrinated or led to believe in Western culture is sort of associated with maybe the contribution that we have, or rather what we do, with our lives, specifically from the masculine end of things, what we do with our careers. We look at the Steve Jobs and the Elon Musks of the world in present day and think, wow, maybe those guys are really living out their purpose because they're doing something that's really grand. And I'm taking it, a little bit further back towards the core of what's the reason that each of us came to live here. And of course, perhaps none of us can truly know this for certain. And a number of spiritual philosophies have alluded to this in various forms. But for me, I look at purpose as really this road back to wholeness. And I guess the question is, well, why? And when I look at what's sort of disconnected us from this maybe innate state that I believe we possess, that's, fully connected to our soul, that's connected to essentially this concept of oneness. I look at the culprit, perhaps lack of better words, being trauma. The thing that disconnects us early in life, usually beyond anything that we can control. We're born often into circumstance, depending on what you subscribe to. I guess the question is, did we choose to come into the families of origins, or the family of origin, or really the circumstances that we were born into, that we were raised within the environment, the container? And so each of us, I believe, sort of experiences this inevitable amount of trauma in whatever capacity. Obviously, some of us more so than others within the mental health space. There's definitely a key difference between capital T trauma and the more nuanced traumas, which I believe, again, is really just disconnecting us from our bodies, from our essence, from our spirit, from our minds, from one another, and really knowing who we are. And so when I think of purpose, it's very much a healing process. It's very much a journey of self-discovery, yes, but even more so of being able to begin to shed the layers of the not self. And that process takes us into quite a bit of historical context of how did we become disconnected, right? Back to the trauma. How did we essentially kind of get off track from this really authentic expression that I would argue we knew when we were young who we were? And conditioning, circumstance, trauma itself tends to be the things that knock us off that path. So I believe it's an inherent part of being a human being. It's also a cause for a lot of suffering. But if we can maybe reframe it a bit, we begin to see, I think, that it's inextricably linked to our purpose in life.
I'm finding this really interesting, this reframing of purpose as, I'm hearing it as almost the end state, the goal we're getting to. We want to get back to purpose, and what you're saying, in a way, I'm desiring to be connected to my purpose. And hearing that, the first thing you said was about how we're conditioned. There's this conditioning around career and work. Identity and career are so linked in our society. In my experience and your experience, we've talked about that in our friendship, and how that's been part of both of our journeys and part of both of our works. And so I hear that's something that that is coming from not self. You described it that way, coming from outside, right? But then I like how you talk, when you zoom back, it is trauma that is the beginning of this that shapes us, I guess, in a way, that these traumas that shape us, um, maybe would you say shape how we relate to that conditioning that society is putting on us too, is going to be, I mean, trauma. Say some more about defining trauma, I guess. I think this is a great way into your work.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I would say, they're definitely sort of interwoven into one another, and conditioning itself can be traumatic. If it's taking us away from our authenticity, if it's taking us
Yes.
away from, who we truly feel that we are. I know I work with a number of clients that have been, including myself, that have just been conditioned based around expectation, based around, being shoved down, their throats a specific religious indoctrination, right? Or this is what we do in our culture. And believe it or not, but we're not all born to be cookie cutter or imprints, of our parents or our childhood caretakers. And so, yes, I mean, trauma itself, I think it's so nuanced, and historically we've kind of reserved the term for more of the capital T's,
Right.
acts of violence, obviously, full just, disclaimer here on trigger warning, rape, sexual abuse, various forms of physical abuse, emotional abuse, all the abuses. And the reality is it can be very, very nuanced when it comes to taking us off track. So I think trauma is really the focus.
Say a little more too about how these nuanced traumas, maybe even an example from your life, how one of these more subtle traumas or nuanced, I like that word, has showed up for you recently, and how you've worked with it to get back to purpose.
Mm. Well, the biggest one I've been working with lately, and I don't know if it would be classified as necessarily a small trauma, but it actually involved my birth. And my birth, which was very much unbeknownst to me having any significance in my life, my first experience upon landing on this rock, um, was being pulled out of the womb, out of my mother with a forceps. And because I was born prematurely and to a mother who had type 1 diabetes at the time, they wanted to run tests. And, I think I was jaundiced, and they wanted, to pump me full of antibiotics. And so I was underneath the incubator, in the incubator for about 10 days. And unbeknownst to me, up until recently, that was a very traumatic event. And I'm realizing how, by way of my internal system, specifically like how my nervous system really started to shape around this trauma, right? And how my attachment system really started to come online and sort of start to take on adaptive qualities as a means of survival. And so when I'm looking at, this strong pattern of avoidance in my present day, or really something that I've been working through as of late, so I'd like to say I'm moving away from avoidance, which I think maybe we'll get into in a little bit in regards to the attachment styles.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I look at sort of my baseline with my nervous system that typically was kind of in a survival state, in the fight or flight state, the sympathetic activation, which resulted in things like a lot of rage and anger as a young child, dealing with this dysregulation in my body. I start to understand why I was the way that I was, or why I am the way that I am. And so something that has created sort of a low grade suffering, and a constant one at that, which of course has this real compounding effect on my life as it's shown up in each respective area at different times throughout my life here on earth. It's created a lot of pain. And so without me knowing that, which of course very few of us, if any of us, we're not supposed to have really any explicit memory of our birth itself. This kind of thing was very much existing far beyond my cognitive faculties, my explicit memory. And so it was just creating, a low grade suffering for me. And so what I've had to do in terms of how it relates to purpose, to answer your question, is really begin to sort of, yes, there's been a healing process involved with that. And a lot of that is learning what are the nuances that specifically within a relational context, especially within the context of my relationship to the feminine, right? My mother in this case. What is the type of nurturance, the type of ways that I need to be met that are going to create this corrective experience for me, my body, my soul, to be able to come back into more of this regulated sort of state of peace, the desired states that kind of exist across the spectrum of, self-help and a number of spiritual disciplines.